My name's Brandon and this is Cartoon Network Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on all of the video games based on Cartoon Network shows and retrospectively review them. After what has felt like an eternity, we have finally arrived at the final Ben 10 game. Well, it was the final Ben 10 game until Cartoon Network decided to reboot the show 3 years later and release a game alongside it. But technically, it was the final Ben 10 game, even if it was for the briefest of moments. Ben 10 Omniverse 2 was released on November 9, 2013 for the PS3, Xbox 360, Wii U, Wii, and 3DS. As you have probably noticed, this Ben 10 game is advertising itself as a sequel to the first Omniverse game. While some of the Ben 10 games have hinted at sequels with after-credit sequences and that sort of thing, we've never really had a game that continued a story in this franchise. In fact, we really haven't seen that at all when you look at Cartoon Network games as a whole. I guess the Code Lyoko games followed the story of the show, but considering how much they changed and switched styles in between games, they never really felt too connected. Omniverse 2 was developed by High Voltage Software, which means Monkey Bar Games, who developed the original, have been booted from the sequel. Considering how I felt about the first Omniverse game and the solid track record for High Voltage, I'm definitely not complaining about this switch. If you've watched my previous videos, you'll know that they developed codenamed Kids Next Door Operation Video Game and The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy. I thought the Kids Next Door game was solid, but Grim Adventures was absolutely fantastic. They also have lineage with the Ben 10 franchise, having developed Protector of Earth, which was the very first Ben 10 game which kicked off this 6-year avalanche of titles. As is the norm, Omniverse 2 was published by D3 and Bandai Namco. While I am excited to have High Voltage back, critically the game was a massive flop. Of the 10 billion different versions available, only the PS3 has an official Metascore, sitting at a disturbingly low 33. Generally when I review these games, the critic score is low or middling, but the user score is much more favourable. Here, that's not the case. The user score for Omniverse 2 is a 4.7, yikes. It also seems that not many big time outlets gave this game a look. Nintendo Life gave it a 3, while official PlayStation Magazine Australia gave it a 2. I have trust in High Voltage Software, but those review numbers are scary. But before I jump into my review of Ben 10 Omniverse 2, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel, if you haven't already done so. Subscribing means you'll never miss a single video, and while Cartoon Network video game history is starting to wind down, there are plenty of big games to come. It's not long until Steven Universe will make its first appearance, while the Adventure Time console games and Cartoon Network Battle Crashes are also coming. And in the not too distant future, Nickelodeon video game history will be starting. That means Rugrats, the Nicktoons crossovers, and plenty more kart racing and party game crossovers. If you like what you're seeing, make sure you click subscribe. But now, it's on to Ben 10 Omniverse 2. I am so glad the Ben 10 reboot game exists, because the Ben 10 franchise ending for good on this game would have been depressing. Ben 10 Omniverse 2 is a Ben 10 game like no other. At this point we pretty much know what a standard Ben 10 game is. It involves a bunch of different aliens in a beat 'em up style, going from enemy arena to enemy arena, occasionally solving traversal puzzles. There have been slight tweaks and improvements on the formula, but it's generally remained the same, except for the downloadable title Rise of Hex, which was a departure from the norm. Omniverse 2 is a little familiar, but also radically different. Your first introduction into the gameplay gives you immediate insight into this new direction. Remember Temple Run? That was a pretty solid game that gained notoriety in that specific era of iOS games. I know I personally sunk a lot of time into it when I got my first iPhone. Well, the success of that game, which launched in 2011 mind you, has somehow influenced this 2013 Ben 10 game. The first thing you do here is a Temple Run style chase segment. Initially I thought that maybe this was going to be a little small addition to the Ben 10 formula. Nope, this is literally half of the gameplay here. By late 2013, Temple Run was well and truly irrelevant, so the fact that High Voltage went all in on this is a bit of a swing and a miss. But just because something isn't hot anymore doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Unfortunately, High Voltage didn't manage to match the quality of Temple Run in these gameplay segments. These segments basically replace the traversal from other games. Instead of platforming or just running along to your next area, you're asked to navigate these hallways. To get past the various obstacles, you'll obviously need to make use of Ben's aliens. Each alien is put into one of 3 categories. They're either a small alien, who are fast and agile, a medium-sized alien that can use ranged attacks, or a large alien that can use brute strength. For the most part, these alien classifications only play a part in the running. In the regular gameplay, you're free to use whatever type of alien you want. Before starting a new level, you're asked to pick your loadout, having to stick to picking one of each type. The console version of Omniverse 2 gives you 10 aliens to play with, but surprisingly, the 3DS version has access to 16 aliens. Also, the 3DS version has 21 levels, while the console version has 7. Of those 7 levels, one of them is the tutorial, which takes about 2 minutes. While the last level is the final boss battle, which is similarly short. Yes, that means as a whole, Omniverse 2 is incredibly short. It can be beaten in under 2 hours, making it easily the shortest Ben 10 game. But back to the temple run sections. My big gripe is that they're just fundamentally boring, while also not controlling well a lot of the time. Temple run is a fast experience, while the running here is pretty slow, even when you're using the fastest aliens. It ends up making for a pretty dull experience a lot of the time. There were also plenty of moments that made my eyes roll. Many of the obstacles are placed in a way that are just completely unfair and give you a fraction of a second to react to. In these sections, the game constantly switches from being way too easy to offering the hardest obstacle course you've ever seen. Flicking the stick to turn corners was also a crapshoot for whether it would work or not. If you're going to copy Temple Run, of all things, you better not make your version significantly worse. None of the polish of that game is present here. To make matters worse, these running sections occasionally feature moments where you have to chase an enemy down. These are terrible. At first, they are ridiculously basic. The enemy is just running away from you, so all you need to do is switch to your fast alien until you're in range, then switch to your medium alien to deal damage. Once you bring the health bar to 0, the segment is mercifully over. It's just so dull, easily one of the most bland experiences I've had. Eventually, they try to change this up slightly, allowing the enemies to drop bombs behind them. Instead of adding difficulty to the game, it just makes the section drag on for longer. It is so incredibly tedious. Every now and then the game would tell me I'd unlocked a shortcut, but I could never tell if I was actually using them or not. Generally, when you unlock a shortcut in a game, it's super obvious that it's saving you time. But here the game was just carrying on as normal, so who knows? I was hoping that maybe the other half of the gameplay could be the savior for Omniverse 2, but that was certainly not the case. The combat might be the worst it has ever been in the Ben 10 series. Okay, maybe that's a bit harsh, but just like the running, it is remarkably dull. You just go into an arena, which is basically a literal arena here, as you're cordoned off into rooms or cordoned off by laser screens, and then button mash, and then you move on. There is absolutely no need to think while playing this game. It is so mindless, and not in a good way. The game features a fair few combos for each alien, and they actually include an easy to digest layout of these combos on the pause screen. So it's a shame when the enemies are so dull that none of this is actually necessary. Just spam A or B and the combat will be over in no time. In combat, there is a distinct difference between aliens from different classes. However, the aliens in those same classes all feel exactly the same. All of the heavy aliens felt equally slow and powerful, while all of the small aliens felt equally quick. It felt like picking between aliens in the same class was purely an aesthetic choice. As you have probably noticed from the gameplay footage, I played as Crash Hopper for 99% of the game. This was for 2 reasons. The first was that playing as the heavy aliens was not enjoyable. They were so slow and clunky to maneuver, and it felt like there wasn't an equal trade-off between speed and power. There's no point being a heavy alien and having that extra power if a dude with a gun can just stand back and take pot shots at you. Switching between aliens isn't at all seamless, so it wasn't like I could just hop from alien to combat this. The second reason I used Crash Hopper so much was because it was the first alien I upgraded, and the only small alien I ever upgraded. Upgrading is a little bit different from the norm here. Instead of the usual experience points based system, you're tasked with finding upgrade tokens. While some of these are handed to you while just completing the main objectives, most of these will be found off the beaten path. Additionally, when you nab these tokens, the game upgrades an alien at random. You have no choice over who gets the buff. This setup caused major issues for me, which all resulted in me saying, screw it, I'm not going to chase after these upgrades anymore. The process involved to get to these hidden upgrades is tedious, and once you do get there, you don't even get to choose who receives it. To me, it felt like a pointless task. Crash Hopper had already been upgraded, so I just stuck with it until the end. Slowly, I had aliens from the other 2 classes gain upgrades, and you guessed it, I just stuck with those for my loadouts. Using non-upgraded aliens was pointless. They are vastly weaker, and it's not like they gain experience from being involved in the combat. It's just a bad system. To make things even better, my favourite thing in all of Ben 10 games is back. The annoying Omnitrix draining feature. I really thought we had moved past this. Cosmic Destruction did it perfectly, but we're all the way back at square one. Every time you do anything in this game, your Omnitrix meter drains. Once it hits 0, you turn back into Ben. Unlike the first Omniverse game, turning into Ben is actually a penalty. If you take a single hit, you die. In the first game, Ben was basically another alien, so I actually like this alteration. Ben should be weaker than his alien forms. However, the overall idea of you switching back into Ben sucks, and it stifles the gameplay. When I say that anything you do drains the meter, I mean it. Just running through the temple run sections drains your meter. It also feels like High Voltage have taken more inspiration from that mobile game here. In an endless runner like Temple Run, the general rule is that once you die, you start back at square one. Omniverse 2 takes this idea and applies it to the levels. Basically, when you clear a combat arena, you get a shard that upgrades how long you can stay in your alien form. However, this resets every new level you go to, meaning you have to rebuild up your Omnitrix's abilities. This is insanely annoying. Having your Omnitrix drain so fast every time you start a new level is just a pain in the ass, and it makes it feel like Ben isn't progressing in the game. You're always back to square one no matter what. It just gave me this feeling that everything I was doing was pointless. Nothing I did mattered because the game would just reset itself at the next level. On the rare occasions that you might actually fail during a level, you're forced to start all the way back at the start. This initially seems like it would absolutely suck. Who wants to fight through an entire level's worth of enemies again? However, once you restart, you'll find that all the enemies stay dead. This means you run through empty levels to get back to where you were, which also absolutely sucks. What is the point of this? Why have me start back at the start if that's not actually a penalty? There's nothing stopping me from just getting right back to where I was. It's just a tedious extra hurdle that doesn't need to exist. Outside of the gameplay, Omniverse 2 is equally messy. In almost every single way, this game feels low budget. This game doesn't feature a single proper cutscene. There are moments when Ben is talking to Azimuth, but these are all in-game and involve the two just standing still. There is also almost no variety in the enemies or locations here. The first few levels all take place in the same bland spaceship hallways, and it got to the point where I thought the entire game was taking place here. Eventually you do go to Earth for like 5 minutes before you're back in space going through the exact same environments. Alongside this, the handful of enemies you encounter in the opening minutes are pretty much all you get here. Very rarely do you get a new variety of enemy, but it's also samey. Not only do you do the same thing over and over again in the gameplay, but you don't even get anything new to look at or fight. It's incredibly bleak. And then you have the game's OST, which I swear consists of just 2 tracks that are constantly repeated. This is all then summed up by the game's overall length. If it takes you much longer than 2 hours to beat, that would only be because you explored literally every section of this game to get the upgrades. There is no meat on this game's bones. It's not quite as short as Powerpuff Girls' Chemical Extraction, but it's still pretty bad. A game's length doesn't generally denote its quality, but in this case it does. Everything about Omniverse 2 screams rushed and low budget. The game's story, which is almost non-existent thanks to not having any cutscenes, has no link to the first Omniverse. I'm not joking. This game literally couldn't be any more divorced from the one that came before it. Heck, Rook, who was a massive part of the first Omniverse, is not even mentioned here, let alone shown. I guess the 2 in the title could represent that it's the second game based on the Omniverse series, but when people see a number in the title, they generally expect some sort of continuation. There were literally 3 Alien Force games, and none of them resorted to this. They all had unique subtitles to distinguish them from one another. If High Voltage wasn't going to make an actual sequel, then they should have just called this Ben 10 Omniverse Alien Run or something. What's even more baffling is that the end of the game seems to tease some sort of sequel or continuation of this game's story. It's so freaking confusing. The actual story here is pretty baffling too. It basically jumps from level to level and feels like there's absolutely nothing connecting them. There's no cohesion to the story, and for most of it I was scratching my head wondering what the actual endgame was here. There's basically no main villain you're rallying against until like the final 30 minutes. It's just yet another major issue that Omniverse 2 has that makes the whole thing an unpleasant experience from start to finish. What a disaster. Ben 10 Omniverse 2 could only have been a bigger failure if it was a glitch-filled mess, or if there was some insane Cooking Mama style drama. There's not a single thing I can praise this game for. It fails at copying Temple Run, it makes the beat-em-up combat worse than it has basically ever been, and everything screams cheap and rushed. The inclusion of those running segments is honestly so confusing. It gives me the feeling that High Voltage wanted to make a Ben 10 Endless Runner mobile game, which actually sounds like a good idea, but they had to make a console game instead. Part of me also thinks that the people at High Voltage Software just did not care about this game. Take a look at the projects they were working on around this time. In 2013, the same year this game came out, they worked on the PC port for the reboot of Mortal Kombat, DLC for Saints Row 4, and Injustice: Gods Among Us. Those were some of the biggest games at the time, so you couldn't blame the team if they looked at this Ben 10 game and didn't really care all that much. High Voltage had been making licensed games since the 90s, so I'm sure they were far more focused on working on these bigger titles. Regardless of what actually happened behind the scenes, Omniverse 2 is a failure. Luckily, there's still one final Ben 10 game waiting in the wings. Next time we'll be looking at Adventure Time Explore the Dungeon Because I Don't Know, which is the first home console Adventure Time game and the last game before the switch to this current generation of consoles. Will Adventure Time be able to continue the solid start we had with Hey Ice King? Make sure you subscribe to find out.